Hello and welcome to my feedback to your group, Kyla, Nicole, and Kennedy, on your Google Hangout 1 on leadership. So I'm going to start with Kyla being a facilitator. I think that you had a really good group discussion, and the flow of questions and your responses was very well coordinated, so I really enjoyed it. You started with the long movie, The Mind Walk, and trying to make sense of it and look at the Cartesian approach as it applies to Homeland Security and emergency management. So I did like the discussion that you brought about the machine and the mechanistic concepts that are at the heart of the Newtonian and Cartesian era. And as you well know, that sort of era also impacted the scientific research as well, which what we call was very positivist. So it was based on confirmation of theory, taking a particular concept into parts and examining the parts and seeing how the processes work. And so you discussed a lot of different things within Homeland Security and emergency management, particularly the external factors that come into the field of Homeland Security and emergency management. And specifically, if you look across all different mission areas, you have hazards, you have threats, you have terrorism, you have pandemics, you have critical infrastructure, you have all those different fields that come in to feed the field of Homeland Security. So in that sense, the field is very multidisciplinary. So I think you mentioned, Kayla might have mentioned the external factors. So Homeland Security and emergency management is not a very clean-cut field, and it's still a field that tries to define itself. So obviously you're going to have different perspective and different pieces trying to intersect with one another. And it's enough to look at the different sectors of critical infrastructure and how changes in one might, in a cascading fashion, affect the other. So Homeland Security and emergency management particularly is that field of a new science, of a more ecological perspective or connectedness of systems perspective. And rather than competition of different sciences, more of a coordination of different strands of thought into one. Nicole mentioned the environment, and certainly when you look at the history of specifically in emergency management of approach to hazards and even response and recovery and all those issues, the environment initially was not even taken into account, and now it's becoming a larger part of our thoughts on handling domestic incidents, on handling terrorism issues. So the environmental threats, the technological threats, the human threats all feed from different disciplines. So a leader in that type of environment cannot be following the assembly line type process. And I think Kennedy put it very well when you said that those leaders will have to wear different hats. And so it is a departure from a very strict specialization in one area and very, very good expertise in one area to suddenly being more of a generalist, to look beyond your field of study to see where you can connect those different theories that might have been contributed from other fields of study. And as far as your system perspective with a reference to question about Jack, you did talk about Jack specifically focusing on his political agenda and the reasons that he might have and why he might have not won the presidential bid for the election. And how he was, I believe, mentioned a pragmatist, so somebody that's very practically oriented, but trying to sort of figure out that there's more connectedness to those issues. And I don't know if you recall from the movie, but it was a female researcher that talked about her specific expertise and development of weapons, and then not seeing very clearly the consequences, political ramifications of the research that can affect other fields as well. So again, the more of the part of the being part of the system discussion was very relevant. And I think you brought up the immigration at some point, and different communities. And you know, the way we look, if you look in a mechanistic perspective at the issue of immigration, you know, we have this discourse whether, you know, the humanistic side, as Kennedy like to say, and then the security side, and we tend to look at those issues in a two opposite ends of the spectrum perspective. On one hand, we want the people that come in here come with dignity and human dignity. On the other hand, you know, we do have security concerns about the vetting process, about possible, you know, drug routes and things like that. But there's a lot more to the entire immigration process than just taken apart into pieces from the mechanistic perspective, because you have journeys and pathways of people, and you have laws and processes in our immigration system that haven't been sorted out for many decades. And so if we allow just the political discourse, it's going to have those two ends of the spectrum, a very mechanistic way of looking at it, where we need to adapt a more integrated framework, which of course is a huge challenge, but this is a kind of environment or homeland security and emergency management in which it's challenged. And you know, you talked about the wider sense of different communities. This is certainly a very big preoccupation of homeland security and emergency management. Obviously, you deal with certain problems differently in urban areas versus rural areas, in you know, border states, or you know, like Texas versus the midland or interior of a state, in states that have a certain type of commerce versus certain type of tourism. So there's so many different variables. If you just look at one variable, you're not getting a whole picture. And so this is where you brought in the emotional intelligence and the ability to look in that domain of interpersonal or interjurisdictional or transjurisdictional or interdisciplinary. So again, if we are just looking at one specific issue, I like to talk about the pound of flesh when we're talking about the mechanistic system. And if you recall, there was a Shakespeare play called The Merchant of Venice. And in The Merchant of Venice, there is this merchant that, you know, is getting a loan, and is being told that he has to repay it, or he would have to give a pound of flesh to the loan shark. And certainly the merchant cannot repay the loan, and then there is a legal process, and the loan shark requests the pound of flesh. And the argument of the courts is that he can't really pay up with a pound of flesh because there is no such a thing. If you look at the human body and a human system, then of course, from the ecological perspective, you can't give somebody just a pound of flesh. At some point, you're going to have the veins and arteries and nerves connected, and you know, where one ends, the other one begins, and the blood flows, and so on and so forth, and the cells are sort of merged. So it is impossible to extricate, possibly, from a human body just a pound of flesh. And it's a very similar concept that operates in this more organic versus reductionist thinking, you know, with respect to understanding those interconnections, those external, you know, macro level and meso level and micro level connections that we have in Homeland Security and emergency management. So when you looked at the review, the Harvard Business Review on sine qua non of leadership, so the essence of a prerequisite for leadership in Homeland Security and Emergency Management, the emotional intelligence is cited as the most critical by Goldman. And so you mentioned the 5 domains of emotional intelligence, and while we're going to talk more about emotional intelligence, I think it's really important to state that unlike IQ, and I don't think you really teased it out in your conversation, but unlike IQ, which pretty much plateaus or levels out in puberty, so when we are getting to adolescence, you either Einstein or you Forrest Gump or you somewhere in between, and then that's the IQ you got. So basically, you know, if you don't have the Einstein IQ, you do have several constraints on your intellectual capability. And for many decades, businesses and leadership studies focused on IQ and the certain qualities that we are born with. You know, the fact that leaders are born, not made. There is this argument. Well, emotional intelligence and all the studies on emotional intelligence indicate that those areas of developing oneself, developing the relationships with others, fostering empathy, learning about motivations, what motivates me versus what motivates somebody else, realizing the social responsibility for others and how people fit in organizations. This is something that develops and we can develop in us until late 50s. So emotional intelligence is an art that is up for development, which is the other reason why it is so critical. Because while we might be doomed on an IQ, and IQ, by the way, predicts very little of success in life. Arguably, about 10 to 20% of IQ predicts the success in life. It is the emotional intelligence and over 50% of emotional intelligence that predicts the success in life. And so you had a really good discussion on social skills as being necessary. And sometimes, you know, we put so much value on experience, and certainly experience is important. You know, when you're dealing with those complex situations or complex issues, as we had a discussion in that hangout all along, then you require some level of domain expertise, knowledge, knowing past historical cases, doing, you know, the post-mortem analysis, having been there, having done that. Those are all the blocks that constitute professionals. But ultimately, the experience in itself falls flat short of interpersonal skills and understanding others and having very strong active listening skills and degrees of empathy. So we typically, you know, we like to think in reductionist terms and standardized terms, and, you know, taking things like a clockwork to pieces because we can wrap our arms around those. Once we have those systems that are so interconnected, you know, we are outside of equilibrium and outside of our comfort zone. We would like to cross all the T's. But in those complex systems, that type of approach is not very productive because you might have those gaps, and how you are dealing with not knowing and how you're dealing with uncertainty and how you're dealing with other people is going to be a lot of times more critical than just domain knowledge. And I want to tell you something really interesting. I do professional development for women in law enforcement, and we have this exercise that's called Good Boss, Bad Boss. And the ladies are supposed to rank 10 most critical things that make a really, really horrible boss, and 10 most critical things that make a really, really good boss. And never in a decade that I have run that training, the knowledge of processes and procedures ever scored number one on the best boss. So people do not value experience or expertise knowledge as much as they value those human factors. And, the most of the time when you see on the top 5 out of 10 is going to be trust. It's going to be somebody being approachable. It's going to be somebody who is not a micromanager. It's going to be somebody who is not a bully. It's going to be somebody who has empathy. It's going to be somebody who's got credibility, which in a lot of ways is connected to experience, but credibility is also, how people perceive that person versus, how many certificates or degrees that person has. So emotional intelligence is certainly very valuable to people in organizations. And when you take organizations as complex as public-private partnerships and, public sector versus NGOs and all that, the ability to navigate that field of interconnections is really critical. And we've discussed that in emergency management classes, but we really never put, any theory of leadership to that. But it's that, emotional intelligence approach and more of a holistic, organic leading approach versus the mechanistic one that, we are teasing out. It's critical to all those important missions in Homeland Security and emergency management. Now, Kennedy mentioned that technical skills are not everything. The empathy for the team is really important. And also, when you think about leaders, the job of a leader is not to spot what, who is weak and needs to go, like in Taylor perspective, right? If people were not performing to the task, then they were let go. It was a very it was a process very devoid of that humanistic approach. Whereas a good leader has to realize that they have constraints on themselves because they are not going to be perfect in all the areas. But a good leader also knows how to not focus on weaknesses of an employee, but how to shore up their strengths and how to monopolize on their strengths. And case in point, in different organizations, you've got people that are, let's say, introvert versus extrovert. Extroverts, they just take energy from other people. They cannot function without others. They are outgoing. They speak before they think. They want to share. They are enthusiastic. The introverts, on the other hand, need their energy comes from themselves first before they go into other people. They like time for reflection. It takes them longer to formulate a course of action. And to the extroverts, they might seem aloof. The extrovert to an introvert could seem, really shallow sometimes, all talk and no action or no reflection. Well, in organizations, you've got both. So a good leader is able to diagnose, who is an extrovert in the organization, who is the introvert, who is going to need more time to think about the issue. So that's very critical. If you have briefings, if you have planning sessions, and you notice that, your employees are not talking, maybe that is not the way that they make decisions, that they know immediately what course of action to take. So that's just one example of exhibiting this ability to create functioning teams of people and focusing on their strengths and building on their strengths and not sort of driving down or berating their weaknesses, which is counterproductive. And, the research documents that the more you push on somebody's weakness, the more demoralized and the more unwilling those people will be to work on those, because, we like to work on what we do well. And so the quality of a good leader is to diagnose who brings what to the table. Not everybody is a great writer. Not everybody's got great technical skills. So on the team, you've got somebody that sets up the Google Hangout, somebody that writes the notes, somebody that can speak, somebody that can, point the camera in the right direction. But the point is to diagnose who can be doing what to the overall mission of a team. So I thought you had a really, really good discussion on that with the fitting people in the best places for them. And self-awareness, of course. We have to start by this first dimension. You know, how do we operate? How do we make decisions? How do we think about issues before we can connect to other people in the field, before we can link to other organizations or other people in our organization? We have to understand what is it about us, our shortcomings, and the things that we bring to the table. So if we don't reflect on how we accept criticisms, how we accept feedback, how we process information, are we more focused on being in control? Are we self-confident? Are we a good public speaker? And all those things. So I think emotional intelligence starts with a self-assessment. You know, what is it about me that is strong, weak? Where are my areas where I can leverage the best? And then without that strong foundation of knowing yourself and having time to think, because you know, that's a problem with a lot of fields within emergency management and homeland security. It is a very reactionary field in the field. So if you're working critical incidents, if you're working, you know, responding to terrorism or whatever it might be, pandemics, it is a very action-packed field that prefers field experience, right? So field experience is not necessarily the best if it's not reflected upon, if we don't gauge ourselves in how we did and how we can do better. So self-assessment is really critical. Self-assessment of incident commanders, self-assessment of city mayors, self-assessment of emergency managers. If they cannot properly self-assess, then it's going to be harder for them to also evaluate how people work on their teams. And how do you know? So the question for you is, how do you know what people think about you? How do you know how people perceive you? How do you know that? That's a question for you to ponder. We are going to come back to it later in the course, but you yourself, how do you know how people experience you? Do you know? How would you know? Because this is a really true first departure point for any leader in those type of environments. And of course, you talked about social skills and the motivation. There are a lot of theories on what are successful leaders with respect to employee motivations. And there are a lot of different theories. I really like the theory by Hersey and Blanchard that we're going to discuss later in the semester. And particularly I like that theory because it links to generational divides. Not all people that have low motivation need to be chucked out of the organization. Not all people with really high motivation achieve in the organization. There are a lot more other factors to consider. So good leaders would have to know a lot of characteristics, not only the degree of motivation, but also the degree of longevity of a person in the organization, their experience. And based on a combination of low, high motivation, low, high experience, and so on and so forth, different models of development could be adapted. Whether you direct somebody to do something, when do you direct somebody to do something? Because I just said so. And in Homeland Security and emergency management, there is going to be situations where that tactical decision-making is critically important. When you don't have time to build consensus, when you can't afford to build consensus. And then there are going to be other areas where you have to have participatory decision-making, where you have to do the input. And that's going to be different through different stages of crisis management, and also, you know, at a different mission areas, whether it's mitigation or planning or response or recovery, and so on and so forth. So the ability to diagnose those, you know, the motivations of others at different, you know, and other different factors that come into account. It's not just all about motivation. You cannot say that the person that is unmotivated needs to be checked. Again, that's going back to Taylorism. We've got to look at ourselves as leaders and see why this person is not motivated. What are the other factors that are there? And most of the time, 90% of the time, good leaders realize that lack of motivation is usually because of other factors that go on. And if they don't diagnose them correctly, they can lose really good employees, or they can have very ineffective management of the particular situation. Confidence, the degree of confidence as far as assertiveness or acquiescing, do you acquiesce or are you assertive? Or are you overconfident and you display hubris, which we've discussed in our classes as an enemy of Homeland Security and emergency management? The excessive reliance on knowing the best and the best course of action. So the emotional intelligence is about that. It's about gauging, what degree of confidence is needed in what kind of environment, what degree of pushing others is needed in what type of environments, what degree of listening to others versus, telling others what to do and when. And that's what makes, the emotional intelligence so fascinating, because a lot of those issues that we are dealing with are not really necessarily the issues of, organizational structures. It's a lot that happens between people and those relationships. So I really enjoyed your discussion on that. Nicole, I think, broke it down for us. Self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. I think you mentioned the awareness of language barriers. And I think that came from our triage exercise, a year ago or so, when we used a role player that was just speaking Spanish and tried to determine how the teams dealt with her. And for most part, teams did not deal with her. They just, since they didn't speak Spanish, they just bypassed her and moved on to do their operations. And so that's a very, very good example that, sometimes we get so entrenched in that clockwork that we don't have that external view of other factors that come in. And in our society today, the linguistic diversity is really huge, particularly with safety and security in mind. You've got to have communications, risk communications that reach everybody, that are appropriate for different cultural groups and different audiences. Some dissemination of information doesn't work with certain groups. For example, if you're thinking about the elderly in disasters, and disseminating via Facebook or, social media and tweets and things like that, this might be that one particular group that will not benefit the most out of that delivery. So again, a good manager, a good leader in those situations, somebody that can diagnose those particular constraints. Kennedy was talking about the control of impulses. This is really huge. This is really huge, particularly in emergency management, maybe not so much Homeland Security, but in emergency management, historically, emergency management has been driven by response. Even though we've moved to the cycle of preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, it is response that gets the headlines. It is the response that gets on the media. It is a response where the field people are so visible. And so impulses are, very visible, and the situations are very dynamic, and there is a lot of unpredictability, and there is a lot of stress. And successful leaders in those situations are the ones that are able to realize what those impulses might be, how you react to people, how you deal with people. A police officer dealing with a nurse at the crisis, a good leader, a law enforcement leader would understand that nurses work in a totally different environment on day-to-day basis, right? And we, some of you did the exercise with nurses. So their environments are different than the law enforcement environment. So again, the leader in Homeland Security and Emergency Management has to have that basic awareness on how different fields contribute different things and different ecology and different environment and different expectations. Kennedy talked about walking with people, and that's certainly the concept of servant leadership by Sir Giovanni. He was the one that coined the servant leadership in education, and a big part of it is the skill of active listening. You know, we tend to speak. We tend to listen less. Of course, any experienced investigators will tell you that the people will tell you a lot of things without you really asking, as long as you know how to listen to them. And so the art of active listening and looking for other people's input of their version of events is really critical. Case in point, you know, we've got those active shooter scenarios, and the concept is that there is this first team, contact team, that goes into the building, right, and looks in the direction of the sounds of a gunfire. Let's say if it's a shooter. And so the important thing is that if you exclude everything else from the members of that team, they're going to miss intelligence. They're going to miss safety conditions. They're going to miss situational elements that can impact their decision making. So again, we have to practice that awareness, and that, you know, active listening is part of it. Empathy. Okay, you had an interesting discussion on that part of emotional intelligence being empathy, and the balance of when you can be too much of a feely person, you know, too much feeling oriented, versus, you know, you've got all those rules and processes that need to be instituted, that a lot of times, you know, because we're not talking about totally throwing away mechanistic thinking, right? You know, you need that for certain organizations. Case in point, you can't run a prison on the organic, holistic, humanistic approach alone. The prison is about the calling out accountability several times a day. It's about making sure that the gates are locked as soon as you move to different parts of the building. You do not leave one open before you open another one. And then there's just a lot of protocols that make that particular system work. So for different systems, obviously, those mechanistic processes are going to be really important. But at what point, you know, you are too rigid. You know, you totally lack empathy because the rule is the rule is the rule. And, you know, you don't have to look very far in Homeland Security and Emergency Management. You can just look at the, you know, the world as we know it. And the Nazi Germany, for example, you know, the people that ran the concentration camps, that were simple soldiers, that were told to do simple jobs, that were based on a simple task of loading the people into the gas chambers and turning on the knob and putting in the Cyclone C and making sure they removed the bodies after that, and that they made sure that they kept the whole scene pretty secret, so not to cause panic for the other people coming in next for their so-called showers. And so the big historical question always has been, how did those people go and did those jobs without questioning the ethics of it, the morality of it, the humanity of it? And it's because they were in those mechanistic systems. And again, so it's not a new issue of the levels of empathy coming in or emotional intelligence coming to certain structured processes. I think in law enforcement specifically, you have this concept of discretion, more so maybe than other response organizations. The law enforcement has a great deal of discretion at the local level, and they can give you a warning, they can give you a ticket. There are certain rules, there are certain criminal laws, but at the same time they can exercise caution, they can give you a warning under certain circumstances, and all of us want to have an empathetic police officer stop us at the traffic stop, right? So in some situations, empathy can not be that good. So case in point, think about Oklahoma City bombing. In Oklahoma City bombing, when the building went down, when the explosion happened, the rescuers, particularly the Oklahoma Fire Department, were recalled about an hour into the rescue operations. And they had those people that were trapped under the rebar and concrete and crying and pulling out their hands and asking to be rescued. And the reason that they were recalled is because there was a fear of secondary explosion and secondary device. So obviously the decision was made by the incident commander to get everybody out for accountability and to make sure we are not in an active hot zone that could explode. And it was very hard for those firefighters to leave those victims there because they didn't know, if those minutes were critical for saving them or not. And some of them were about to violate that order, but they all complied. But this was a very difficult decision to make. You have empathy for those people you're saving. At the same time, there is some other overarching priority of a mission to make sure that you make it through the day and you can come back and be productive and actually save them. So so that's always an interesting discussion on the empathy levels, to what point, but that's emotional intelligence. The emotional intelligence is to be able to determine when you can relax the rules and when you actually have to be more tactical or more mechanistic, so to speak. So Kennedy, I think you had a really good discussion on that you have to still have regulations, standard operating procedures, and then if you have to look at other reasons, you can assess each type of a situation separately. So you can't be so entrenched that you don't see other factors, but sometimes that mechanistic thinking in certain situations is a start, it's a platform, and then you can look for the deviations. But it's all, again, based on your self-assessment, awareness, and relationship with others, and so on and so forth, and experience, certainly, that comes to that. Kayla was talking about the benefit of using teams, and certainly the collaborative concept is, prevalent. I can't think about any domain in Homeland Security and emergency management where people work alone. Even analysts in their offices with the charts and connection points and software to crank up, more and more networks, even they cannot work alone because they have to be very acutely aware what the operators in the field are doing. So it is a very, it's not like a researcher type of work that they can sit and think about ideas in the room. It is a very collaborative process. Also, you discussed the globalization as a huge factor in changing, sort of our mechanistic thinking into more interconnected thinking, cross-cultural dialogues, getting cues from, other cultural settings, need to retain talent. I really like that it's part of a leadership, is to be able to, again, diagnose who brings what to the table. That's, that's your ICS 101 as well. Who is going to be a good safety officer? Who is going to be a good logistics section chief? Well, those two positions are so totally different, right? One person needs to get things. You have a person has to be a little bit more authoritarian and say, you shall not go into those operations because they're unsafe, and I have the authority to tell you no. Whereas the logistics section chief is going to say, I'm going to get you the ski map, I'm going to get you the pizza, I'm going to get you the water, I'm going to find a way to do that. Takes a different set of skills. Obviously, if you don't have an ideal person, you use who you got. That's also a concept of flexibility in incident management. But kind of think, historically, when I think about organizations, when people retire, we give them a golden watch, we take away their keys from the office, and we take their computers, and they sort of fill out the sheet what they're leaving, and they sort of go. So the ability to retain people or leverage people experiences is really critical. And I think in our field, Homeland Security and Emergency Management, there's quite a lot of retired people that teach, that consult. We've got, in our college alone, when you think about it, a lot of our adjuncts that teach undergraduate classes in criminal justice are, former chiefs, police officers, agents, and so on and so forth. So when you have that expertise that's captured, it's always very beneficial. Emotional intelligence accounts for more success of people in the organization. I already mentioned that, but the most critical part of it being that we can be able to empathize more. We are able to improve our own thinking about ourselves. We are able to increase our levels of confidence, and we do that through mastery of things. We do that by seeing other people that can do that as well. So those dimensions of emotional intelligence can be improved, increased, enhanced, and nurtured in people, leaders and the followers alike, or if you use that dichotomy of leaders and followers. So again, very, very important thing about emotional intelligence. It's you're not stuck with something. Obviously, you had a discussion on the fact that some people just don't have social skills, and it's really hard for them to develop them. And certainly there is going to be some people like that do not have very good social skills. And so, the good leader would look at how to develop those people, or how to put them in functions, but perhaps require less of that skill and utilize, again, the skills that they're good at. And that goes to that emotional intelligence of the person that is leading the organization. So the next question you move on to was about managing complicated versus complex environments. And Kennedy brought out, I think you liked that example. I think it was Kyla and Kennedy that you both discussed the ball, the billiard ball, and the breaking of a billiard game, and unpredictability of the movement, that you never ever have the same player. You can have interferences in the system depending on your stick, depending on the ambient temperature in the room, depending on the amount of beer that somebody drank before they hit that ball, depending on who was leaning on the table, depending on how old the velvet is that covers the table, and so on and so forth. So this is a really good analogy to see the complex being unpredictable versus complicated, or just clockwork, mechanistic, standard procedures that have solutions to them. It might be very difficult to find those solutions that will depend on experience, that will depend on pattern matching, that will depend on expertise, but those solutions are to be found in a system. Versus complex, where solutions might be novel. And somewhere in your discussion, I think you brought, it might have been Kyla, you talked about sense making in complex systems. So in complicated systems, we are pattern matching, we are analyzing, we are deconstructing and putting back together. Whereas in complex, we might not ever had that particular event before. We have never seen or anticipated or imagined that type of situation. So we are probing and we are sense making instead of trying to look at matching two things together that we know from experience. And I think that what it makes me think about, if you took the my class in intelligence, is the approach to security and safety issues before the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War and after. And I like to use this analogy of puzzles versus mysteries. So in a Cold War, in an intelligence field, you knew who the enemies were, where pretty much the world was divided into, it was us versus them, the whole Soviet bloc plus, whoever was subscribing to their ideologies, and the United States and their friends. And so because we had countries as enemies, we knew how those countries worked. We knew their political systems, we knew their militaries, we knew their research, we knew their capabilities. What we didn't know was how much or where, right? We knew that Russia had a specific type of tank. We didn't know where, and we didn't know how many. And so it was trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. We had the boundaries of a country. We had the boundaries of a political system. We had to read through the lines to figure out where the pieces are. But we knew we were looking for certain pieces that made sense. Whereas in intelligence field and the security and safety threats, in a post-Cold War era, and specifically since 9/11, we're looking at mysteries. We're looking at very dispersed threats that don't have boundaries, that could be singular actors, that could be group, that adapt. Countries don't adapt very well, right? Political systems don't adapt very well. It takes years for a political system to change unless there's a revolution. So it's much harder to deconstruct something because we don't know what we're looking for. We don't know where, we don't know how many, we don't even know what we're looking for. So in that sense, we entered a very complex system where we are divinating mysteries, so to speak. We're not putting puzzles together. And I think that's, a good illustration to that shift from complicated of the industrial era to complex of the interconnected and globalized world, and with safety security right there in the middle of it. So I really liked your example about the billiards, but I also think that sense making in mysteries takes a totally different way of thinking than putting together puzzles, right? Because you can get very good at putting puzzles together. You can, it will take you, if you take the same puzzle, it's take it for the very first time. It'll take you 20, 30 minutes, depending how good you are. But if you do it over and over and over again, you're going to have a strategy of, I'll do corners first, then I'll do the rim, then I'll do the middle, then I'll look for landmarks, then I'll look for color, then I'll look for this, then I'll look for, and as long as all the pieces are there, you can cut that town down as a good puzzle master guru to really minutes. Mysteries are different, right? Every mystery is different. Every mystery has all those balls that can go in either direction. And, it's anybody's guess where you're going to end up. So that comes with that notion of unpredictability. And this is what we are in, boys and girls. We are in the world of unpredictability. We all like to know the outcomes. We all like to figure out what's going to be. But in the world as complex as today, predictability is less and less achievable. But people like to be sure about things. People like to be certain about a certain risk or lack of that risk. So that's where the big challenge comes in to the leaders in Homeland Security and emergency management, specifically, so they are not in an illusion that they know how to find the pieces when what they're doing is they're in the middle of a mystery. And that's when the Kunavan comes in framework, which I guess it's Welsh. And the framework tells you about events that are simple, that are complicated, that are complex, and then the area where you can slide into the total chaos. And I think you had a really good discussion on, complex systems. Even small deviations can have consequences that are not anticipated. And I think Kyla talked about the bite marks and the imprints, and in a crime scene investigation, looking for patterns and stuff like that. That's certainly not the mysteries environment. The mysteries environment is, a lot more complex than that. So with the Kunavan, I think the most important thing to retain from that is that a good leader will know where they are. Am I in a complex situation or am I in a complicated situation? As long as they are aware where they are on that scale, then the less probability that they're going to fall into that abyss of chaos, because they will realize that they have to switch their way of thinking, that there might not be a solution to the problem. If you acknowledge that, then you're more likely to probe and do sense making instead of being stuck on looking for a specific piece of the puzzle. And if you look at intelligence community, look at the weapons of mass destruction debacle in Iraq, and try to think about what kind of frame of mind people adopted, or leaders, when they were tackling those issues. Did they develop, were they thinking about complicated problems, or they were thinking about complex problems? And most importantly, did they know what environment they were in? Because in a complex environment, it's going to be, again, because it's unpredictable, it's going to be hard to find solution. And policy makers and politicians and the public are going to really expect, because that's human nature, they're gonna want answers, and they want to know probabilities, and they're gonna want to know outcomes. And so leaders of the future and Homeland Security and emergency management have to realize those limitations, have to realize that those processes are going to be different. And so the messaging to the public, the messaging to the politicians, the messaging to the policymakers has to reflect those realities as well. You can't tell somebody, Houston is 100% prepared for X, Y, Z, because you're speaking about complex issues. So, and this is where the trap is for leaders, that they want that degree, or they're expected to provide that degree of certainty that in the complex systems is often very, very hard to achieve. So what can we do? Having a shared common operating picture, trying to get the other perspectives, trying to listen to other experts, trying to acknowledge that there might be more than one way of doing something, maybe not with the ideal outcome, but maybe with optimal outcome for that situation, and understanding that things are connected. Why is it counterproductive to use complicated solutions to complex systems? Again, it sort of creates the tunnel vision. It creates the false sense of confidence in the outcomes. Because, if you think you're going to find that piece of a puzzle where, there might not be that piece of the puzzle, might be something totally different, might be big blob in the middle, then, that creates the false sense of security as well. I think one of you, might have been Nicole, was talking about the willingness to learn all the time. And I think that is huge for leaders, is the lifelong learning. We have to acknowledge, and a good leader acknowledges, that they don't know, that they know as much as they can at the particular moment, but that we are all learning from developing situations. So the lifelong learning, that's particularly important for practitioners with many years of experience that are very resistant to, let's say, new ideas, innovative ideas, creative ideas. That's very important for you. Millennials entering the workplace and coming across what is often referred to as dinosaurs, that tell you we've always done it that way and it worked. Practitioners that might have outdated arsenal of solutions. And again, they are working in a complicated type of environment where there might have to be time to switch thinking to complex systems. Wayward spiral. I think Kyla said that whole reading put her to sleep, and so I thought it was interesting. So you brought the discussion back to Newton and Tyler, and plans versus and lessons learned, and so on and so forth. Every incident is going to be different, and flexibility. So I think that, we can all agree at the end, what we're talking about is unpredictability increasing in a complex world. And with it, requirement of more and more and more of flexibility. I looked at requirements of emotional intelligence, of the emotional intelligence factors. It was a different model for law enforcement. And believe it or not, but for law enforcement, one of the 5 dimensions of emotional intelligence that predicts success is flexibility. There's also optimism. There's also self-regard. But flexibility is one of them. So people don't like uncertainty. So that's a challenge for leaders, that they have to manage people's expectations of certainty and having the right solution for the right scenario, for the right thing, in the right moment. And I think that's where our discussions in Homeland Security and emergency management need to go forward, that we have to embrace the fact that we are in such a diverse, dynamic, and complex world that, predictability is impossible. We have to constantly do the sense making and do the what ifs, and be flexible in our understanding on the topic. I think Kyla summed it up really nicely towards the end, saying life is not a Lego set, which makes a great point to my analogy of puzzles and mysteries in a 21st century security and safety environments. And so even though you might want to break the processes up, they're not always, there are not always a Lego set, so to speak. They don't come, not everything comes with previous instructions or lessons learned. Now, with that in mind, lessons learned are important because at least we have some foundational knowledge, but we have to take that lessons learned, or giving us answers to complicated issues with lessons we don't yet know about that are going to come. And that's where, good, flexible leaders of the future are going to be in this field. So I wanted to thank you for your discussions. I'm looking forward to the next one. I'm glad you worked out all the technical kinks out of it, and you had a good flow of the conversation. And I think at the end, you covered all the points. So see you next time.